I'm Zach Bagans. I'm going to tell you about a case I kept for years, the one that never stopped knocking at my edges of sleep. A family moved into an old boarding house with creaky stairs and a history that smelled like dust and secrets. On paper, it was routine. New tenants, modest rent, a landlord who handed over a ring of keys and smiled the way strangers do when they hide too much. In reality, this place had a third floor that hadn't been opened in 40 years and a story about a little girl who'd vanished there one autumn night and never returned. The family thought they were buying a fixer-upper with charm. They found charm. They found cheap hardwood floors and crown molding and a basement with a washer that still worked. They didn't know that the third floor existed as a memory more than space, a sealed story in wood and plaster, a floorboard lid nailed closed and painted over because officials had decided long ago it was safer this way. The landlord told them it was storage rats maybe, he joked. They took it at face value. That's how this kind of thing starts. Small compromises followed by larger ones. 2 weeks after they moved in, the wife woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of footfalls above the ceiling. She thought it was the neighbor. She thought it was the house settling. By the third night, the steps were precise. They crossed the ceiling directly above their bedroom, right to left, then stopped. She sat up and the steps restarted, the cadence of a child at play. The husband slept through it until one morning he found toy blocks lined by the bedside table, 6 wooden cubes placed in a row, each one turned to the same face, 3 dots, 2 dots, a single dot. He had never owned these blocks. The wife called their son in from the other room, but he had been asleep under his own blanket. They searched the house for a source. Raccoons, wind, a branch tapping. Nothing explained a measured pattern of footsteps that sounded like a small pair running in circles directly above them. When the mother finally unlocked the attic door, she found it solid. Where there should have been an opening, there was wood and paint. Nailing and plaster had sealed any access. The third floor was sealed shut, as if time had been poured over it. She called the landlord who had handed them the keys. He said, "They boarded it up years ago. Fire hazard." He changed the subject. That night, the knocking started. It wasn't an accidental knock. It was a deliberate rapping, 3 light taps in quick succession, and then a pause, then the same 3 taps again. The sound came from above, impossibly contained by the ceiling and yet full of direction. When they pressed their ear to the floorboards and listened, there was a tiny voice that followed the knocks, not a whisper. A child's voice, thin and clean, asking to be let out. "Let me out," it said exactly 3 times, each plea synchronized with the triple knock. The son heard it too from his bedroom. Woodwork expands and contracts. Voices don't arrange themselves into pleading requests that match knocks one for one. They called me because they trusted my show, because they felt exposed and helpless in their own home. They sent videos, grainy phone recordings of the ceiling and of a plaster wall vibrating with the thud of small feet. The files were odd. Audio showed clear taps, the waveform precise and not the accident of settling wood. The video showed no visible movement. The power of this case was the gap between what could be recorded and what could be seen. The knocks existed. The person making them did not, at least not in ways our cameras could accept as normal. I flew to the town the next week. The boarding house was 2 stories of late 19th century frame, paint flaking like old scabs, front steps that bowed under the weight of decades. The landlord met me at the door, older than his paperwork suggested, a thin man whose eyes slid when I asked about permits and inspectors. He was the type who spoke in easing phrases and then left questions to their natural silence. He admitted the third floor had been sealed long ago, after an incident. He refused to be specific. That sealed air around him told me everything I needed to know. People who seal things away do so with patterns of avoidance. The house, at first glance, felt like any old building carrying the memory of people. But as soon as I set up a recorder and stepped inside, the air changed. The living room hummed with residual life. In the kitchen, cabinets opened themselves a fraction, as if remembering hands. Upstairs, down the hallway that led to the plastered-over hatch, a line of 3 faint ridges marked the ceiling where the knock had been recorded by the family. My EMF meter fluttered with the kind of noise you see when something is either powering itself or being powered by the body of the building, the brain of a house, in a way. Houses have rhythms, and this one had learned to use its rhythm to speak. I asked the family to demonstrate what they had heard. The husband stood in the bedroom and tapped the ceiling twice as a joke. The air didn't reply. Then the son put his palm flat on the ceiling, and soft 3 knocks answered, precise and clean, like one person tapping a measured Morse. It was unnerving to watch a simple hand call back across an invisible divide. The knocks didn't reverberate randomly. They came from a single point. It was as if a small fist beneath the sealed floor was knocking on the underside of the house with purpose. I spent that night alone on the couch in their living room with every recorder and camera I had. I didn't want to alarm them. I wanted data, not hysteria. After midnight, the house settled. The kitchen clock ticked like a heart. Then the taps returned 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks, quiet, patient. On my recorder, the knocks were clean and lacked ambient vibrations secondary to structural settling. Someone or something intended to communicate. So I responded aloud, because we sometimes talk back to houses as a protocol to elicit reaction. Who's up there? On the tape, after a beat, a voice came in. It was thin and small, childlike, shaped around innocence and sting. Let me out, it said, the syllables clipped and sure, matching each triple knock. The hair on my arms rose. There was strategy behind that voice. It intended to persuade, to cajole with familiarity. I didn't want to dismiss it as influence or ventriloquism. This voice carried the smell of a child's breath, a single, distinct quality you don't fake easily. I dug into the local records. 40 years ago, the boarding house had been a different kind of place. Notices in old county minutes mentioned a child's disappearance and a partial investigation that never concluded. The name listed in the ledger matched the ghostly calls of the present, a little girl named Anna who had lived on that floor with her aunt. She had been last seen crossing the 3rd floor landing toward the stairwell on a cold night in October. The next day, the family reported her missing. The house was searched. The police found nothing. At some point in the weeks that followed, carpenters had boarded that well-worn landing over and nailed it into silence. People in the town claimed it was for safety. Official files were thin. The paper trail died like fog. What remained was rumor and the way people refused to speak certain names. We staged a controlled attempt to open the sealed 3rd floor hatch, not to set it free, but to see what would happen when the boundary was challenged. The landlord sighed and produced an ancient key ring with heavy keys. His hands trembled when he fit the largest key into the lock, and his voice was small when he said, "We always left it sealed for the boy who lived upstairs." His words were wrong gender. He misremembered the details. That misremembering is exactly what these locations do. They blur truth with the convenience of forgetting. We posted cameras. We prepared sound equipment. We prepared to document. When the board came off, the smell hit us first old curtains, dust, and a deeper something we couldn't name. The 3rd floor room beyond the hatch was smaller than the house's silhouette suggested, a low, narrow corridor, little scuffs on the planks where a doll or a small shoe might have dragged. There were tiny handprints in the dust on the new attic beams, and somewhere in that air was the faintest trace of perfumed lavender, the kind of scent a child might sneak on from a grandmother's dresser. We peered in. There were no contemporary toys, no modern artifacts, only old paper dolls preserved under decades of dust. And at the far end, where the boarding had been nailed up, there was a small, perfect imprint in the wood, as if someone had pressed their palm there until they left a shadow of skin. The knocks began again, this time from within the floor cavity itself. 3 precise taps that matched the pattern we had been tracking. The voice answered without moving. "I'm on the inside. Let me out." The attic was a sealed box with no vents that could logically carry a voice precisely to the floor below. Yet the sound came with such clarity we all heard it as if a child sat on the rafters and spoke down. It was tempting to say the family's mind had created the echoes, or that the building made the sound from wind, or that we had inhaled expectation and exhaled belief. But those explanations didn't fit the data. Clean waveforms, single-source knocks, voice patterns that returned perfect imitations of the mother's spoken tone when prompted. We asked the attic plainly, "What happened to Anna?" The voice softened like a hand running along the lip of a bowl, and it answered, "They took me when my light went out." The wording was childish and oddly specific. We pressed further, and the voice spoke in fragments. "I hid. I called. They said I had to sleep." The door closed on the other side. There was a texture to these words that spoke of being small and hidden and hoping that someone would knock back and pull the latch open. That hope had endured 40 years. I could have left the boarding house to time. I could have told the family to move and walked away. But someone's plea is a physical thing. It hangs in the air until you touch it with action. I arranged for a forensic structural assessment, an official reopening of the cold case. We contacted descendants, local archivists, anyone who might stitch the thread of Anna's disappearance back to a taut line. The town responded as towns do. Some doors closed, some memories opened reluctantly. We didn't find the answers that night, but we opened doors for further investigation. I left the house with recordings that still haunted me. The triple knocks, the little voice, the smell of attic lavender, and the weight of a story that had waited 4 decades for someone to respond. I went back the next week with a small team and a plan. We weren't there to stunt or to scare. We were there to collect facts, documents, testimonies, physical evidence, so the story could be told beyond the tremor of a home recording. The first thing I did was pull every public record I could find. Police reports, property deeds, old newspaper clippings. Anna's name appeared in a thin, half-sentence police blotter entry. Child missing from 3rd floor boarding, investigation ongoing. There was a second entry a month later noting the case was cold. That was it. The original detective was dead. Witnesses were gone or had moved. The trail ended where most of these disappearances do, against the thin skin of time. We interviewed folks who remembered the boarding house when it served lodging for seasonal workers. One woman in her 70s told us Anna had lived there with an aunt who worked nights at the textile mill. Little girl, she said, didn't bother nobody, wore a blue dress, used to leave her blocks by the window. The details were specific enough to be meaningful, but vague enough to leave room for imagination. Memory is like that. Sometimes it preserves the shape of a thing and loses the texture. Still, multiple accounts matched. A small girl, a 3rd floor room, a family hush once she disappeared. I wanted to know why the 3rd floor was sealed so definitively. The original boarding owner had died long before, but his son, middle-aged now and still in town, remembered the day they boarded the landing. There was talk of an accident, he said. Something happened, a fight. It scared folks. We sealed it because people were scared to go up there. He winced when he said it. That wince told me more than his words. People seal things for many reasons: fear, shame, convenience, but the sealing itself becomes a witness. A sealed floor doesn't lie, it hides. We brought in a structural expert. He cut a window into the plaster, just enough to insert a fiber optic camera. The view revealed a narrow corridor 3 rooms long, a small patch doorway at the far end, and a floor thick with decades of dust. There were dolls, old cloth scraps, and most chilling, a child's shoe wedged under a beam, yellowed leather cracked but still shaped like it had once held a small foot. The camera feed froze on that shoe. I watched it with my team and felt a kind of sea change. Evidence shifted from story to object. Objects don't argue. Objects don't misremember. We staged another night, this time with more eyes and more sensitive gear. I wanted direct responses. EVPs, precise motion detection, focused on the areas the family had identified, thermal points on the ceiling where footsteps had been heard. We started our session just before midnight. For the first hour, the house did what old houses do, settling. Small mechanical groans, the distant sound of a dog in the street. Then, like a hand on a clock, something changed. The temperature on the 3rd floor dropped in a single, smooth wave. Our thermal imagers registered a slender column of cold air, straight as a pipe, moving from the ceiling above the family's bedroom toward the attic hatch. On the audio tracks, we recorded 3 clean knocks, twice, spaced exactly like the pattern the family had captured. You could set a metronome to it. We called back with the same cadence. 3 light taps on the underside of the floor where the son had pressed his palm. The response came, almost immediately, 3 knocks. But this time there was a tone under the impact, a thin harmonic like a glass being struck. That harmonic gave the knocks a quality I couldn't explain. They were not merely percussive, they were tuned. The house was answering in a voice. We played the session back and slowed the waveform, searching for artifact or coincidence. The knocks remained single source and the harmonic held. That was the technical part. The human part came after. A child's voice, recorded faintly on one of the high-gain mics, repeating a phrase in a clipped, careful cadence. Help me, let me out. It wasn't just mimicry. The phrase matched a pleading syntax a child would use. It also matched the phrase recorded in the Hale family's initial audio. That repetition told me the entity or whatever lived in that sealed space had a limited vocabulary and a repeated plea. Repetition is a tactic. Repetition is hunger. We interviewed the landlord again. He'd been unwilling to speak at first, but seeing the evidence changes people. He admitted he had been aware of rumors, of a dispute years ago between the borders that turned ugly. He told a fragment. They argued. It got loud. Something was said about the girl. He stopped, looked down at his hands, and refused to elaborate. When I pressed, he finally said quietly, there were men who came, and after that, people wanted it closed. For peace. The phrase for peace is often used to paper over accountability. I took his words and added them to the ledger of facts we were building. Sealed floor, a scuffle reported, men coming and going the night before Anna vanished. What I wanted most, though, was to find a physical trace that connected the attic space to a human action, the kind of trace a court could use, not just a story. We called in an evidence tech to comb the corridor. Under UV light, the dust revealed Smudge's handprints that had oxidized into darker lines across the boards. One set of prints was small and high, like a child's hands pressed to steady themselves. Another set was broader and stronger, overlapping and almost wiping at the edge of the child's prints. That overlap suggested two people in proximity, one steadying the other. The prints were faint, but they were there. I photographed them, measured them, and cataloged the impressions. A pair of hands had been working in the wood. The timing remained unknown, but the presence was undeniable. As we pressed into the case, a new thread emerged from an unexpected place, a private diary found by the family in the landlord's box of old receipts. It had been misplaced among rent ledgers and evaporated promises. In faded ink, a woman had written about sleepless nights and the sound of children laughing on the third floor. She had written, with increasing agitation, that a group of men had come to the house carrying lanterns and that a quiet disagreement had occurred. Her last line in the diary read, "They said it was best to close the landing. It is not sleep I hear now." Handwriting analysis linked that diary to a woman who had lived in the house at the time, an elderly sister of someone long gone. The diary was circumstantial but telling. It placed a witness in the house in that period and suggested there had been conscious choice involved in sealing the floor. With the prints, the diary, the shoe, and the recorded responses, the narrative shifted from mysterious to forensic. Now we had layers, human actors, a covering up, and a persistent sound that had not dissipated in 40 years. That persistence suggested two possible pathways. Either something supernatural had embedded the sound into the wood as a replay, or human intention had created a ritual seal that maintained a memory like a loop. Either way, the third floor had been acting as a receptor for one voice for decades. We took another step that night with permission from the family, a controlled reopening for documentation only, with crime scene procedures followed and a court liaison on standby. We did not expect miraculous answers. We wanted to see the sealed cavity in daylight and treat it like evidence. The landlord watched with a hard face. We removed the boarded hatch and crawled into the narrow space with our cameras and lights. The corridor smelled of dust and age, but also of something else, citrus and laundry starch, small things children carry with them in pockets. We found more toys under floorboards pushed aside, a ribbon that had been woven through a crack, and scratches on the wall at child height. Near the far side, behind a patched seam, we found a hollow, a scant 2-foot opening leading to a cramped cavity. It was not large enough for an adult to pass through comfortably. It gave the impression of being used for concealment, not habitation. We drew a boundary around the cavity. We photographed. We collected trace fibers. We recorded the site for a future excavation if the family pursued justice. And then we asked the question that still haunted me. Why did the girl's voice continue, and why did it still ask to be let out? Theories can be nefarious or tragic. Perhaps Anna had been concealed inside that crawl space in fear, and the men who came left her there for a moment that became a forever. Or perhaps the seal was a cultural response, a community decision disguised as safety. Either way, a child's hope had endured in a loop for decades, becoming the house's most persistent sound. When I left that night, I carried with me the sort of evidence that doesn't announce itself loudly but insists. The shoe, the prints, the toy fragments, the diary pages. More importantly, I carried the knowledge that the voice was not simply an echo, it was a living plea repeated until it owned the space. In the car, I listened to the night's audio again. The child said, "Let me out," and under its plea, a second voice seemed to whisper the name of a man, a word I couldn't place. I slowed the track, enhanced the frequencies, and the syllables resolved into an old name from the town records. I held that revelation like a coal between my fingers. It was small then, but it could burn if pursued. I knew the case wasn't finished. I also knew walking away now would be its cowardice. The knocks had begun as curiosity. They had become an indictment. What happened next would depend on whether the town wanted truth or quiet. I returned to the boarding house with a name one whispered beneath the girl's plea on the recording. The name belonged to a man who had lived and worked at the boarding house the year Anna disappeared. His connection to the family was unclear, but his presence in that house during those days felt deliberate, not incidental. The town had filed him under laborer, handyman, night worker, but deeper records showed complaints involving him, arguments, noise disturbances, a confrontation about a child crying too loudly. Those details weren't enough to convict a ghost, let alone a person, but they formed a shadow behind the sealed floorboards, a suggestion that someone had been involved in the child's last moments. I drove to the address listed on the old census. It was a derelict property, sagging roof, tattered siding, a yard that looked like no one had stepped into it in 20 years. A neighbor across the street watched me with the suspicion people reserve for anyone investigating old wounds. She approached only when I introduced myself and explained the case. Her expression softened as if something long buried had been given permission to surface. She said the man we were looking into had left town shortly after the incident. She didn't know where he went, but she remembered hearing men argue in the boarding house that night. She recalled lanterns and shouts. She recalled a woman's scream. That scream was the kind of detail memory tries to bury but cannot forget. She said she always felt that the house itself had been holding something in something that didn't belong in the daylight. She warned me gently not to let it follow me home. I returned to the Hale house as evening set in. The family was staying elsewhere now, but they met me outside to share updates. Their son refused to speak about the voice. He shook when he remembered the knocks above his room, when he recalled the little voice repeating back things he hadn't yet said out loud. Children remember ghost voices differently than adults. They don't add logic or denial. They simply remember what was heard, and what he heard had weight. The mother trembled when she described waking to the sound of small feet running overhead and seeing, faintly, the outline of a child's shadow on the ceiling. She had tried convincing herself it was the movement of headlights from a passing car, but cars don't whisper, and cars don't press small palms against walls with enough force to leave prints through paint. We began a controlled nighttime investigation. I positioned myself on the second floor, directly beneath the sealed third-floor corridor. My team set sensors across the floor, mapping vibrations so we could track the path of the footsteps if they began. We placed temperature probes, EMF detectors, high-sensitivity microphones, and infrared cameras. The house was quiet for the first hour, still as if studying us. Old buildings listen before they speak. Around midnight, the familiar cold wind rolled down the hallway. Not a draft, but a directional drop, as if the air itself had been displaced by something moving through it. My skin prickled. I knew the pattern. It meant the footsteps were coming. A soft patter echoed above me, delicate and light, small enough to be the weight of a child. The footsteps crossed from one side of the house to the other, paced in a loop, then stopped directly above me and waited. I felt a pressure on the crown of my head, the sensation of someone standing on a floor above and peering straight down. The recorder captured a tiny exhale, breathy, trembling, not a sigh, but an attempt to speak. I called out quietly, "Anna, are you here?" The reply came on a thin thread of air, "I'm still here." The voice trembled, childlike, but underneath it lay a resonance, something older, heavier, as if another tone had been layered behind the child's voice. That second layer unsettled me. Children don't speak with harmonics that echo through the bones of a house. I played the last recording softly, letting the voice loop through the floorboards like bait. The footsteps responded. They approached with urgency, then stopped above the ceiling in the exact spot where the boy had placed his palm. That's when the entire house groaned a deep wooden moan traveling through the beams. It wasn't structural settling, it was a communication, a shift, an answer. Something in that sealed room didn't want the words repeated. We moved to the attic entrance, preparing to insert the camera again. As we approached, the temperature dropped sharply 20 degrees in seconds, and the air tasted metallic, like blood on a cold coin. I felt pressure against my chest as if the air thickened, refusing us passage. Then a faint scrape sounded from the other side of the boarded hatch, slow, dragging, like fingers tracing wood grain. The recorder picked it up clearly. I crouched, listening with my ear to the plaster. A child's whisper reached through the wall. "He's still here." The voice wasn't talking about itself. It was talking about the man from the records, the one the town tried to forget. The whisper wasn't frightened. It was warning us. We carefully loosened one board, not enough to enter, but enough for the camera to slip inside. The screen showed the narrow corridor, dust swirling in soft currents like something had recently moved through the space. A small object lay near the far wall. We zoomed in. It was a handkerchief, child-sized, embroidered with the initial A fresh, not yellowed by time, and beside it 3 fingerprints pressed into the dust. Fresh prints cannot appear in a room that has been sealed for 40 years without exposure to living hands. I asked aloud, "Who is with you?" For a moment, nothing. Then a deeper voice boomed through the cavity, rattling the wood, shaking dust from the beams. Mine. The force of it shot through me like a punch of cold. The entire 3rd floor reverberated with a dull, angry thud, as if a fist had struck the walls from the inside. The corridor's air rippled on our camera feed. Something was moving, but not like a person. More like a pressure wave of intent, focused and aggressive. We backed away from the attic entrance, regrouping. Whatever had answered wasn't Anna. It was older, authoritative, territorial. The voice claimed ownership not of the room, but of the girl's spirit. That explained the 2nd harmonic in Anna's voice. She wasn't alone in that sealed space. Something else was speaking through her, or alongside her, controlling the boundaries, manipulating her plea. The house fell silent for several minutes. Then, faintly, the triple knock resumed, tapping from the floor cavity in that steady, heartbreaking rhythm. But this time the voice that followed was wrong. The cadence matched the child's, but the pitch was warped, deepened, stretched into something that resembled a child only in shape, not sound. "Let me out," it said, but the request wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command, a test, a push for compliance. I turned off the recorder. The house exhaled, long and slow, as if acknowledging we understood the shift. The knocking stopped abruptly. A single heavy footstep sounded on the 3rd floor, a step too large for a child. Dust rained from the ceiling. That was the moment I realized the truth. Whatever was sealed in that attic wasn't trapped. It was anchored, bound to the girl's memory, to her last moments, to the weight of what happened. And now that we had reopened the hatch even slightly, the thing that claimed her had room to breathe again. The team looked at me for direction. I told them what I knew with absolute certainty. We were no longer investigating a ghost. We were standing inside the territory of something that did not want to be forgotten and was prepared to make itself known. By the time I returned the next night, I knew we weren't dealing with a standard haunting. This wasn't just a residual replay of a child's last moments. Something older had taken root in that sealed corridor, something capable of mimicking voices, twisting sounds, and masking its intentions behind the pleading voice of a child. Anna's presence was real, but she wasn't alone. She was being overshadowed. She was being used.